Marcus Wellington III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor office, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars below him. But all he could see was his son Jamie's disappointed face from that morning, when another physical therapist had walked out of their mansion with a resignation letter clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. The woman had used words like limited progress and unrealistic expectations, but Marcus heard what she really meant. His 8-year-old boy with cerebral palsy was too much trouble, too broken, too much of a burden for even the most expensive specialists money could buy. 2 years had passed since Sarah died in that terrible car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening, and Marcus felt like he was drowning in a sea of medical bills, failed treatments, and the constant whispers from his business associates who suggested that having a damaged child might hurt Wellington Tech's pristine public image. His phone buzzed with another message from the board members asking when he would return from his family situation, as if his son's condition was something temporary that would simply disappear if ignored long enough. Marcus clenched his jaw and remembered how Sarah used to hold Jamie close, singing softly while the boy struggled with his walker, never once treating him like he was anything less than perfect. But now Marcus felt like a stranger in his own home, hiding behind work meetings and conference calls, because he didn't know how to look at his son without seeing everything he couldn't fix. The latest neurologist had recommended another surgery that might help Jamie walk better, but Marcus had watched his son endure 3 operations already, each one promising hope and delivering only more pain and longer recovery times filled with frustrated tears and sleepless nights. His mother Eleanor had called that afternoon, her voice gentle but firm as she suggested something that made Marcus's stomach twist with dread. She wanted them to visit a small family restaurant downtown called Rosa's Diner, a place Sarah had loved before her death, where she used to take Jamie for pancakes on Saturday mornings when life was simpler and happiness felt possible. Marcus had tried to refuse, making excuses about work deadlines and important clients, but Eleanor's words kept echoing in his mind. That boy needs his father. Not another doctor or therapist or expensive treatment. He needs you to see him as more than a problem to be solved. The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow, because deep down he knew she was right. Knew that somewhere along the way he had started seeing Jamie through the eyes of frustrated medical professionals and judgmental business partners, instead of through the eyes of love that Sarah had taught him to use. His assistant knocked on the door, reminding him that Jamie was waiting in the car downstairs with his nurse, ready for what the boy thought was just another doctor's appointment, but was actually this terrifying journey to a place that held too many memories of better times. Marcus straightened his expensive tie and grabbed his briefcase, knowing that his son would ask questions during the drive. Innocent questions about why they weren't going to the medical center, why his father looked so nervous, why they had to visit some restaurant instead of going home to play video games or work on the puzzle they had abandoned weeks ago. As Marcus walked toward the elevator, he caught his reflection in the polished steel doors and barely recognized the man staring back hollow eyes. Permanent worry lines, the kind of exhaustion that expensive suits and perfect haircuts couldn't hide, looking nothing like the father Sarah had fallen in love with, or the man who used to dance with his baby son in their living room before cerebral palsy became the defining feature of their lives. The elevator descended through 41 floors of successful businesses and confident people, each floor taking Marcus further away from his safe corporate world and closer to a reality he had been avoiding for 2 years, the reality that his son needed more than medical treatments and private tutors and isolation from a world that didn't understand or accept children who were different. By the time Marcus reached a parking garage and saw Jamie's bright smile through the car window, his heart was racing with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite identify, something that felt dangerous and hopeful at the same time, as if this simple visit to a family restaurant might either save them both or destroy what little control he had left over their carefully structured but emotionally empty life. The moment Marcus pushed open the glass door of Rosa's diner. He felt completely out of place in his $1,000 suit among families wearing casual clothes and children laughing over plates of French fries, while Jamie's eyes immediately lit up at the sound of soft jazz music drifting from speakers. Hidden somewhere in the cozy restaurant that smelled like fresh bread and coffee and home-cooked meals his son had never experienced, Marcus watched other fathers helping their children color on paper placemats, or sharing milkshakes without the constant worry that clouded every interaction he had with Jamie, and he felt a sharp pang of envy mixed with shame because these simple moments seemed so natural for everyone else, while he struggled to even have a conversation with his own son without thinking about medical appointments or therapy schedules. The hostess, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron, smiled warmly at Jamie and asked if he liked the music, completely ignoring Marcus's obvious discomfort and expensive appearance that screamed he didn't belong in this humble place where booth seats were patched with tape and the floor tiles had seen better days. Jamie nodded enthusiastically and tried to move his walker closer to where the music seemed loudest, his face showing pure joy that Marcus hadn't seen in months of sterile doctor's offices and clinical therapy sessions. And for a moment, Marcus wondered if his mother had been right about bringing them here instead of to another specialist, who would only add to their collection of disappointing reports. Their waitress approached the table with a confidence that surprised Marcus. She was a young black woman with natural hair pulled back in a colorful headband, wearing the standard diner uniform but carrying herself with dignity and warmth that made Jamie smile before she even spoke. And Marcus found himself studying her name tag that read Keisha in cheerful letters that somehow matched her personality, instead of the awkward glances and uncomfortable silence that usually greeted Jamie in public places. Keisha knelt down to his eye level without hesitation and asked about his favorite songs, her voice genuine and interested rather than the forced cheerfulness Marcus had grown to hate from people who didn't know how to act around his disabled son. When Jamie shyly admitted that he loved music but couldn't dance like other kids, Marcus braced himself for the usual response: empty reassurances or quick subject changes, but Keisha's reaction was entirely different as her eyes filled with understanding rather than pity, and she sat down in the empty chair across from Jamie as if she had all the time in the world. She told them about her 6-year-old daughter, Ayla, who had been struggling with a stutter that made her afraid to speak at school, and how other children sometimes made fun of her hesitation with words, creating a bond between Jamie and this stranger's child that Marcus had never thought possible because he had been so focused on keeping Jamie isolated from potential hurt. As Keisha took their order, chocolate chip pancakes for Jamie and coffee for Marcus, though his appetite had vanished completely, she continued talking to Jamie about music and rhythm and how everyone had their own special way of moving. 2 songs they loved, treating him like any other 8-year-old customer instead of a medical case study. Marcus noticed how other diners glanced over at their table, not with the usual mixture of curiosity and pity he had grown accustomed to, but with gentle smiles as they watched Keisha's natural interaction with Jamie, and he realized that his son was experiencing something he had been denied for 2 years: normal human connection without medical labels or therapeutic goals. The lunch crowd began to thin out around them, families finishing their meals and heading back to weekend activities that Marcus could only imagine, since he and Jamie rarely ventured beyond their controlled environment of private tutors and medical appointments, and he found himself wanting to stay in this warm, welcoming space where his son's disability wasn't the first thing people noticed. Keisha returned to check on them, refilling Marcus's coffee cup while asking Jamie if he had ever tried moving to music while sitting down, explaining that some of the best musicians in the world created beautiful rhythms without ever leaving their chairs. And Marcus watched his son's face transform with curiosity instead of the resignation he usually showed when adults tried to encourage him. When Keisha suggested that rhythm wasn't about perfect movement but about feeling the music in your heart, Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, a recognition that he had been approaching his son's limitations all wrong, focusing on what Jamie couldn't do instead of celebrating what he could do. And he wondered how this young waitress understood something that teams of expensive specialists had missed. As the afternoon sun streamed through the diner windows, casting golden light across their table, where Jamie was humming along to the jazz melody while Keisha nodded encouragingly, Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Son being seen and accepted for exactly who he was, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but as a beautiful child with his own unique gifts and his own special way of experiencing the world around him. What happened next shattered every assumption Marcus had built around his son's limitations, as Keisha stood up slowly and extended her hand toward Jamie with a smile that held no trace of doubt or hesitation, asking softly if he would like to try moving to the music that was playing. And Marcus felt his entire body tense with protective instinct, because he had witnessed too many moments when well-meaning people had tried to help Jamie, only to leave him feeling more broken than before. Jamie looked up at his father with questioning eyes, seeking permission for something he desperately wanted but had been taught to fear, through countless failed attempts and disappointed therapists, and Marcus found himself nodding despite every voice in his head, screaming that this would end in tears and frustration like so many other times when hope had been crushed by reality. Keisha seemed to understand Jamie's uncertainty without needing explanation, and instead of forcing him to stand or move in ways that would highlight his struggles, she began something that Marcus had never witnessed before. She started adapting the dance to work with Jamie's walker rather than despite it, showing him how the metal frame could become part of the rhythm instead of an obstacle to overcome. The young waitress moved with graceful creativity, demonstrating how Jamie could use his upper body to express the jazz melody flowing through the diner's speakers, turning his arms and shoulders into instruments of music, while his walker provided steady support. And Marcus watched in stunned silence as his son's face transformed from cautious hope to genuine excitement. Other diners began to notice what was happening at their table, but instead of the uncomfortable stares Marcus had grown to expect, these strangers started watching with growing smiles and nodding heads as Keisha guided Jamie through movements that celebrated his unique way of being in the world, rather than trying to make him conform to standards he could never meet. The elderly couple at the corner booth stopped eating their pie to watch Jamie discover that his walker could tap out beats against the floor, creating percussion that added to the restaurant's background music, and Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes as he realized his son was not just participating in something beautiful, he was leading it, choosing the tempo and direction of their impromptu performance. A businessman reading his newspaper lowered it completely to smile at Jamie's growing confidence, and a mother with 2 young children quietly encouraged them to clap along, creating an audience that supported rather than judged, surrounded rather than isolated. And Marcus understood that his son was experiencing something he had never thought possible, complete acceptance from strangers, who saw his joy before they noticed his disability. Keisha's movements were patient and encouraging as she followed Jamie's lead, letting him decide when to speed up or slow down, when to add flourishes with his hands, or when to simply sway to the gentle rhythm, and Marcus realized he was witnessing a masterclass in human dignity that no expensive therapist had ever provided. The music seemed to wrap around them like a warm embrace, and Jamie began to hum along while he moved, his voice clear and sweet as it blended with the jazz saxophone drifting from the speakers. And Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest as he watched his son create beauty instead of struggling against limitations that others had defined for him. When Jamie attempted a particularly ambitious arm movement that would have sent his previous therapists into lectures about realistic goals, Keisha simply adjusted her own movements to match his enthusiasm, making his gesture look intentional and graceful rather than awkward or dangerous. And Marcus began to understand that the problem had never been his son's ability, it had been everyone else's imagination. The entire diner had become an impromptu theater, where Jamie was both performer and director, deciding how long the dance would last and what movements felt right to him, while Keisha served as his perfect partner, who enhanced rather than corrected, supported rather than guided, and celebrated rather than evaluated every moment of their shared creation. As the song began to wind down, Jamie's movements became softer and more contemplative, and Keisha matched his energy perfectly, bringing their dance to a gentle close that felt natural and complete, rather than abruptly ended, and the silence that followed was filled with spontaneous applause from every person in the restaurant who had been touched by what they had witnessed. Jamie's face was flushed with exertion and pure happiness, his breathing slightly heavy but his eyes brighter than Marcus had seen them since before Sarah's death. And when his son looked at him with an expression of pride and accomplishment that needed no words, Marcus felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble completely. Keisha knelt down beside Jamie's chair and told him quietly that he was a natural dancer, that his movements came from his heart rather than from any textbook, and that some of the most beautiful dances she had ever seen were created by people who moved differently than everyone else. And Marcus realized that this young woman had given his son something priceless, the knowledge that he was not broken, not limited, not less than anyone else, but simply and wonderfully himself. The drive home from Rose's diner felt like traveling through a different world as Marcus listened to Jamie chattering excitedly about the dance, his son's voice filled with an energy and confidence that had been missing for so long that Marcus had almost forgotten what pure joy sounded like coming from the back seat of their car. Jamie kept talking about how Keisha had made him feel normal and special at the same time, a phrase that hit Marcus like a physical blow because it revealed how much his son had been aware of being treated differently, how much he had internalized the limitations that doctors and therapists and even his own father had unconsciously placed on him through their constant focus on what he couldn't do, rather than celebrating what he could accomplish. That evening, instead of retreating to his home office as usual, Marcus found himself in Sarah's old craft room that he had avoided for 2 years, searching through boxes of memories until he discovered her laptop with hundreds of videos she had taken of their family before. Cerebral palsy had become the defining feature of their lives. He watched with tears streaming down his face as 18-month-old Jamie danced in his mother's arms, both of them laughing as they swayed to music in their living room, and Marcus realized with devastating clarity that he had been so consumed with trying to fix his son that he had forgotten the most important thing. Sarah had taught him that Jamie didn't need to be fixed because he had never been broken in the first place. The next morning brought a decision that surprised even Marcus himself as he called Jamie's private tutor to cancel their session, ignoring the woman's shocked protests about maintaining consistent schedules and academic progress, and instead drove his son back to Rose's diner where they found Keisha working the breakfast shift with exhaustion written across her face in a way that made Marcus wonder about the life she lived beyond these cheerful interactions with customers. During their conversation over pancakes and coffee, Marcus learned that Keisha worked not just at the diner, but also as a night cleaner at the local hospital, sleeping only 4 hours each day, so she could save money for her daughter Ayla's speech therapy sessions that insurance wouldn't cover. And he discovered that her dream was to open a community center where children with different abilities could learn and play together without judgment or limitations imposed by adults who didn't understand their potential. When Marcus offered to hire Keisha as Jamie's companion, she initially refused with a dignity that both impressed and humbled him, explaining that she didn't want charity or pity from a rich man who thought money could solve every problem. But when Jamie himself asked her to teach him more dances, her resolve softened because she could see the genuine connection between them transcended any economic differences. Their weekly meetings at the diner became the highlight of both Jamie's and Marcus's weeks. Sessions where Keisha taught Jamie not just movement and rhythm, but confidence and self-acceptance, while Marcus found himself learning lessons about patience, creativity, and seeing possibilities instead of limitations that no business school or corporate training had ever provided. During one particularly memorable afternoon, Marcus watched his son help another child at the nearby park, a little girl with Down syndrome who was being teased by older children, and Jamie rolled his walker over to her with fierce determination, telling the bullies that everyone was different and special in their own way, using words and confidence that Keisha had helped him find deep within himself. The transformation in Jamie was remarkable, but Marcus began to realize that the real change was happening inside himself as he started seeing his son through new eyes, not as a patient or a problem or a source of worry, but as a brave, intelligent, compassionate boy who had been teaching him about strength and resilience all along, if only he had been wise enough to notice. Marcus's business associates continued to pressure him about returning to full-time work and suggested that Jamie might be better served in a residential facility where professionals could provide constant care. But for the first time in 2 years, Marcus found himself pushing back against their suggestions with a fury that surprised everyone in the boardroom, defending his son's place in their family and in the world with a passion he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. The turning point came during a corporate dinner where Marcus was expected to schmooze with potential investors. But instead of focusing on profit margins and market shares, he found himself sharing Jamie's story and talking about the community center Keisha was planning, watching as several wealthy business leaders became genuinely interested in supporting a project that would help children with disabilities find acceptance and joy rather than just medical treatment. As autumn turned toward winter, Marcus realized that his entire relationship with wealth and success had shifted fundamentally. Money was no longer about accumulating power or impressing others, but about creating opportunities for children, like Jamie and Ayla, to discover their own unique gifts and share them with a world that desperately needed to learn the lessons these special children could teach about courage, acceptance, and the true meaning of human worth that had nothing to do with physical abilities or social expectations, but everything to do with the size of one's heart and the strength of one's spirit. 6 months after that life-changing dance at Rosa's Diner, Marcus stood in the gleaming lobby of the Sarah Wellington Foundation building, watching children with various disabilities laugh and play together in ways he had never imagined possible, while Jamie rolled confidently between groups of new friends, who saw his walker as just another part of who he was, rather than something that defined his limitations. The foundation had become more than just a charitable organization. It was a revolution in how society viewed children with different abilities, offering adaptive dance classes, inclusive art programs, and support groups for families who had been struggling alone, just as Marcus and Jamie had been doing for too long. Every morning brought new challenges and victories as Marcus learned to balance his role as CEO of Wellington Tech with his passionate commitment to changing how the world treated children like his son, discovering that his business skills were perfectly suited for creating systematic change rather than just accumulating wealth for its own sake. Keisha had flourished beyond his wildest expectations, transforming from an exhausted waitress working multiple jobs into the foundation's director of programs. Her natural ability to connect with children and her innovative ideas about adaptive activities making her indispensable to their mission, while allowing her to use talents that had been hidden beneath years of financial struggle and limited opportunities. Her daughter Ayla had blossomed alongside the foundation's growth, overcoming her stutter through the confidence-building programs Keisha had designed, and the little girl now served as Jamie's partner in many of the foundation's promotional videos, their friendship demonstrating to the world what inclusion and acceptance could accomplish when adults stopped focusing on differences and started celebrating unique gifts. The community center that had once been Keisha's impossible dream now occupied a beautiful converted warehouse in the heart of the city, filled with adaptive equipment, art studios, music rooms, and most importantly, the sound of children's laughter echoing through halls where no child was ever made to feel broken or less than perfect. Marcus had discovered that his company's stock price had actually increased since he began openly advocating for disability rights and hiring practices, proving wrong every business associate who had warned him that associating his corporate image with disabled children would hurt his bottom line. And several major corporations had followed his example by creating their own inclusive programs and hiring policies. The foundation's success had attracted national attention, with families traveling from across the country to participate in programs that treated their children as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms to be managed, and Marcus found himself speaking at conferences and appearing on television shows to share the simple but revolutionary message that Keisha had taught him, that every child has unique gifts waiting to be discovered and celebrated. Sunday dinners at Rosa's Diner had become a sacred tradition for their unconventional family, with Marcus, Jamie, Keisha, and Ayla gathering around their old booth to share stories about the week's adventures and plan new ways to help other families find the acceptance and joy they had discovered together. The diner's owner, Rosa herself, had become like a grandmother to both children, always having their favorite meals ready and often joining their conversations about the foundation's latest projects, creating a warm extended family that bore no resemblance to the cold, isolated life Marcus had been living before that fateful day when desperation had driven him to seek help in an unexpected place. As winter approached, and the foundation prepared for its official grand opening celebration, Marcus watched Jamie rehearse the dance routine he had choreographed entirely by himself, a piece that incorporated movements for children using wheelchairs, walkers, crutches, and even those who were completely non-ambulatory, proving that creativity and inclusion could create beauty that surpassed anything traditional dance had ever achieved. The rehearsal took place in the foundation's main hall, filled with parents and children whose lives had been transformed by programs that celebrated differences instead of trying to eliminate them, and Marcus felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought him from a man who saw his son as a problem to be solved to a father who understood that Jamie had been his greatest teacher all along. When the day of the grand opening arrived, hundreds of families gathered to watch Jamie lead a group of 20 children with various disabilities in a performance that brought tears to every adult eye in the audience. Not tears of pity, but tears of joy and recognition that these children were showing the world what true strength and beauty looked like, when freed from society's narrow definitions of normal and acceptable. As the music swelled and Jamie guided his fellow performers through movements that turned wheelchairs into dance partners and walkers into rhythm instruments, Marcus stood beside Keisha, watching their children create magic together, both of them understanding that the little black waitress who had seen potential where others saw limitation hadn't just changed a disabled boy's life, she had saved a father's soul, transformed a family's destiny, and proven that sometimes the most profound miracles happen not in hospitals or therapy clinics, but in humble diners, where strangers choose to see each other's hearts instead of each other's differences, creating ripples of love and acceptance that spread far beyond anything money or medicine could ever achieve.